Hey guys, tonight we begin with a man whose idea of divine genius involved public orgies and making senators watch. Emperor Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, the most chaotic Roman emperor to ever mix religion, power, and very poor impulse control. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. In Rome, the worst thing that can happen isn't being invisible, it's being noticed. Especially by the people who collect humans the way others collect marble busts. You're minding your own business, probably polishing something that belongs to someone richer than you, when a man in uniform stops you mid-task. He looks you over the way a tax collector looks at a ledger. "The emperor requires attendance," he says. Not a question. Not even a sentence, really. Just a notification that your life has been updated without consent. Before you can protest, you're walking through the forum, surrounded by statues that all look like they're judging your posture. Vendors stare. Beggars mutter. Someone tells you to smile because it's an honor. You try, but your face refuses to cooperate. The Palatine Hill rises ahead like a promise and a threat. The imperial palace glitters in the sun, marble, gold, and enough self-importance to be visible from space. You're ushered inside. Everything smells expensive. The walls are painted with gods doing questionable things, which feels appropriate. They take your belongings, your tunic, your wooden comb, your coin for luck, and replace them with silence. A steward gives you new clothes, better food, and a long list of things you're never allowed to do again, starting with speak unless spoken to. It's all very organized, like joining a cult that pays in fear. Other attendants glance at you as you pass. Some smile, most don't. They've learned that expressions are a form of gambling. You hear rumors immediately that the emperor sleeps little, eats too much, and changes personalities more often than his sandals. You're advised to avoid eye contact, but not too much. He might think you're plotting something. Your new room has soft linen sheets and a view of the city, proof that luxury and anxiety can absolutely coexist. As you lie awake that first night, you hear music, laughter, and something that sounds like weeping. Maybe both. You tell yourself you're lucky. You tell yourself this is promotion, not punishment. But as dawn breaks over the marble rooftops, you realize something chilling. You've been invited to live inside power. And power in Rome always eats its guests. From the outside, the imperial palace looks like paradise with plumbing. You'd think a place with marble floors, golden ceilings, and its own indoor waterfall might inspire awe. And it does. Right up until you realize every drop of that luxury was built on someone else's panic. The moment you enter, the air changes. It's perfumed, heavy, and polite, in the way venom is polite before it kills you. The halls stretch forever, lined with guards who stare straight ahead. Not because they're disciplined, but because looking anywhere else has consequences. You're shown the layout by a steward who could guide you blindfolded. He walks briskly, never slowing down, reciting rules like he's describing the weather. Don't speak in the emperor's presence. Don't look at the emperor unless he speaks. Don't breathe too loudly near the emperor. You start to wonder how anyone survives a full conversation here. The servants you pass move like ghosts, silent and precise. They don't make eye contact. They make eye avoidance into an art form. When one drops a cup, nobody gasps. Nobody helps. They just wait. Because the sound of breaking glass travels faster than gossip, and soon enough, a guard appears to remove the problem. And the servant. Meals in the palace are grand but never relaxing. The food is perfect, the tension is not. Every bite is chewed carefully, because there's always the chance someone poisoned something, not out of hatred, but as a career opportunity. Even laughter feels dangerous. At night, the palace doesn't sleep. It simmers. You hear footsteps echoing through the corridors, muffled commands, and the low hum of people trying to exist quietly enough to survive. The Emperor's personal guards patrol constantly, their armor clinking like wind chimes made of bad decisions. Somewhere beyond the next wall, music plays. Flutes, lyres, voices singing praises you can't quite believe. You lie awake on your linen bed, staring at the carved ceiling, and realize something horrifying. The palace isn't built to protect the Emperor. It's built to protect everyone else from him. And as the torches flicker in the hallway, you understand the unspoken truth whispered among servants. In Caligula's palace, silence isn't peace, it's policy. You meet him for the first time on a day that smells like olive oil and overconfidence. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, doesn't walk into a room. He arrives, like thunder pretending to be a man. His robe is purple, the royal shade reserved for emperors and people who like reminding everyone else they're not. The crowd of attendants lowers their heads as one, as if they're auditioning for a synchronized bowing team. You do the same, mostly because you enjoy breathing. When you dare a glance up, you see the kind of face sculptors pretend not to copy, sharp, symmetrical, and constantly shifting between amusement and irritation. Caligula's smile looks generous until you realize it's the sort a cat gives a cornered mouse. He doesn't introduce himself. Introductions are for mortals. He asks questions that aren't questions. Do you serve well? Are you loyal? Would you die for your emperor? You answer yes, yes, and, judging by your pulse, probably. Everyone calls him Divine Caesar now. He started small, declaring himself the beloved of Jupiter. Within a few months, he dropped the beloved part and claimed to be Jupiter. Statues of the gods were recarved to bear his face. Some say he even debated Neptune, god of the sea, by shouting at the waves until they surrendered. It worked, technically. You quickly learn that Caligula's palace isn't just his home, it's his stage. Every gesture is theatre, every audience mandatory. When he laughs, the entire court laughs. When he stops, the silence hits like a verdict. It's less a government and more a hostage situation with better catering. There are people who say he's brilliant, that his madness is just misunderstood genius. Those people are still alive, which probably explains their enthusiasm. The rest learned that disagreeing with a living god has a short career path. You leave the audience chamber dizzy, both from fear and from the sheer weight of the perfume in the air. Somewhere behind you, the Emperor is still talking, about glory, destiny, and something involving the moon. You don't know what any of it means. You just know one thing. Rome's most dangerous man now believes he's immortal. And unfortunately, you work for him. You don't sleep that first night. Not because anyone told you not to, but because you're smart enough to realize no one ever sleeps easily in Caligula's palace. When a guard finally appears at your door, you're halfway between panic and resignation. He doesn't speak. He just gestures for you to follow. His armor clinks in a rhythm that sounds like a countdown. You're led through hallways so polished they reflect torchlight like liquid gold, or like something waiting to catch fire. The palace at night feels different. The chatter is gone, the musicians silent, the marble echoing with only footsteps and whispers. Somewhere down another corridor, you hear laughter, the loud, unsteady kind that never ends well for someone. You arrive at a chamber guarded by statues of gods with judgmental expressions. The guard opens the door, and inside sits Caligula, lounging on a couch surrounded by food, wine, and half-asleep attendants who look like they're praying with their eyes open. He doesn't acknowledge you right away. He's busy telling a story to no one in particular about how he once talked to the moon, and it agreed he was divine. No one laughs. They've all heard this story before. When he finally looks at you, it's like standing too close to lightning. New, he says, as if identifying a piece of furniture. He waves a hand. Sit, eat, smile. You do all three, carefully, as though performing sacred rites. The food tastes like anxiety and salt. Caligula watches you eat with interest, as though measuring how fear affects digestion. Then, as quickly as he appeared, his attention shifts to someone else. He asks a senator to sing, a guard to juggle, a servant to dance. No one dares fail. You realize then that you're not in a dining hall, you're in a test. Everyone in the room exists to prove how entertaining survival can look. Eventually, Caligula grows bored. He claps his hands once, stands, and leaves without a word. The room exhales. You're told you may go. You do, quietly, quickly, and without looking back. In any other household, you'd call it a strange evening. In Caligula's palace, it's just Tuesday. And somehow, you've passed your first night alive, which, around here, counts as a promotion. You don't get a mentor, you get a handler. A woman who's been here so long she's forgotten her original name. Everyone just calls her Domna, which probably isn't her real one either. But you don't ask questions. Around here, curiosity is like dessert. Tempting, but usually fatal. Domna doesn't shout or scold. She just points at things and explains how not to die near them. That tapestry. Don't touch it. It belonged to Tiberius. Caligula hates it. He keeps it there to hate it properly. Or, if he smiles at you, bow. If he laughs, stay still. If he stops laughing, start praying. Your training isn't about skill. It's about silence. You learn to walk without sound, stand without moving, and speak without meaning it. You practice smiling in a mirror until it looks sincere enough to fool a sociopath. By the end of the week, you can mimic cheerfulness like a professional actor trapped in a horror play. Meals are part of the education too. You're taught how to eat in front of nobles without making eye contact or chewing too audibly. Apparently, the emperor once executed a man for rude mastication. You don't even know what that means, but you stop enjoying food anyway. Sometimes Domna tests you. She'll drop a cup just to see if you flinch. You do, every time. Good, she says flatly. It means you're paying attention. You begin to understand that fear isn't a weakness here, it's currency. The more alert you are, the longer you last. At night, you share quarters with other attendants, all pretending to sleep while secretly listening for footsteps. Someone always mutters prayers. Someone else always cries. No one tells them to stop. That's considered teamwork. Once, you ask Domna how long she's served. She shrugs. 3 emperors, she says. 1 died naturally. You don't ask which one. You just nod, impressed by her continued existence. By the end of the month, you've learned how to anticipate orders before they're spoken. You've also learned that survival here isn't about loyalty. It's about accuracy. 1 wrong word, 1 wrong glance, 1 sigh too loud. And you're no longer part of the decor. You're part of the cleanup. Banquets in Caligula's palace aren't dinners. They're public endurance tests wrapped in gold leaf. The invitations alone are a death sentence written in cursive. Refuse and you insult a god. Attend, and you spend the night pretending you're having the best time of your soon-to-be-short life. You help prepare the feast, a spectacle so extravagant it could feed a small province, or at least one particularly determined senator. Tables groan under roasted peacocks, gilded grapes, and seafood hauled in from 3 seas, just to die expensively. The wine never stops flowing, though no one dares drink enough to forget where they are. The guests arrive in togas so heavy with embroidery they could double as armour. Senators, generals, poets, and a few people who have no idea why they were invited, all lined up like sacrifices disguised as social climbers. You move silently among them, pouring wine, refilling plates, and avoiding direct eye contact with anyone who looks powerful enough to ruin you for blinking incorrectly. Then, the emperor enters. The room stiffens. Caligula strolls in barefoot, wearing a crown of jewels and that unsettling half-smile that suggests someone, somewhere, is about to regret existing. He greets no one, yet everyone greets him. He doesn't eat. He observes, like a cat surrounded by nervous mice in expensive sandals. The entertainment begins. Dancers, musicians, poets reading verses that rhyme suspiciously with flattery. Caligula interrupts them constantly, offering suggestions that usually involve less clothing and more discomfort. Laughter ripples through the room. Brittle, desperate laughter that sounds like coins falling into a well. Sometimes he plays games. He'll point at a guest and demand they describe the divine beauty of Caesar. There's only one correct answer: unmatched. Anything less than religious awe earns a polite smile and a guard's hand on your shoulder. You've seen that smile before. It never ends well. As the night drags on, the air turns thick with perfume and panic. You keep your head low, your tray steady, your soul on standby. Around you, power and terror swirl together like smoke, intoxicating, suffocating, and impossible to escape. By dawn, the guests are gone, the music is over, and the tables are empty. Only the fear stays. It always does. By now, you've learned that Caligula doesn't host events. He stages productions. Everything in his world is theatre, and unfortunately, everyone is cast without consent. He calls it entertainment for the people. You call it a public relations disaster waiting for divine approval. But you don't get to name things here. You just appear when summoned and hope the next scene doesn't involve you. The emperor has decided that the palace should no longer be private. Rome deserves to witness its god in action. So, the gates open, the crowd floods in, and suddenly your workplace has an audience. Senators stand shoulder to shoulder with bakers, children, and soldiers, all staring wide-eyed at the spectacle of wealth, wine, and people trying not to faint from stress. Everything is exaggerated. The decorations, the feasts, the flattery, even the applause sounds nervous. Musicians perform until their fingers cramp. Actors recite verses about Caligula's greatness, and every time someone calls him divine, he nods like he's just remembering it's true. You stand off to the side, balancing a tray and trying to look both invisible and enthusiastic, a difficult combination. A senator accidentally spills wine on his robe. You can see the panic flash across his face. Within seconds, he's laughing and calling it an offering to Caesar. Caligula beams. Crisis averted. For now. Then come the reenactments. Historical scenes retold with the emperor in the starring role. He plays gods, heroes, conquerors, often all at once. The supporting cast is made up of whoever looks the most terrified. You've been lucky so far, but you know it's only a matter of time before you're handed a costume and told to look inspired. One afternoon, he stages a naval victory in the courtyard. There's no water, just blue cloth and imagination. He stands on a platform, shouts orders to invisible ships, and throws bread to the crowd, declaring it spoils of war. The crowd cheers, mostly because the guards are watching. When it's over, Caligula bows deeply, as if expecting thunderous applause from the heavens themselves. The crowd obliges. You clap too, not because you want to, but because you enjoy having hands. As you file back inside, you realize the truth. You don't live in Rome anymore. You live in a theatre where tragedy pays better than comedy, and where the curtain never closes. Serving Caligula is a bit like serving the weather. Bright sunshine one minute, thunderbolts the next, and if you complain, the lightning files a report. You wake up each morning wondering which version of the emperor you're getting today. Will it be generous Caesar, the one who tosses coins to servants and calls you his faithful friend? Or will it be Wrath of Jupiter, the one who throws furniture because someone sneezed during his lunch speech? You learn to read the signs, the tilt of his head, the length of his silence, the number of guards standing slightly too close. The palace becomes a living barometer. When Caligula laughs too loudly, people start saying prayers. When he's quiet for too long, they start drafting wills. Sometimes he's almost charming. He compliments your posture, asks about your health, even lets you eat warm bread instead of leftovers. You almost forget who he is. Then, mid-conversation, his expression changes, and he decides someone in the room is plotting against him. Everyone immediately becomes an expert in invisibility. He loves to surprise people. Once he strolls into the servants' hall carrying a laurel crown, declaring that the gods have visited him in a dream. You clap. He frowns. Why are you clapping? Do you think I'm joking? You stop. Why have you stopped? You realize this is less an emperor and more an interactive riddle with fatal consequences. On his calmer days, Caligula strolls the gardens feeding dates to peacocks and reciting poetry to statues. On the bad ones, he orders the same statues flogged for not applauding properly. It's unclear whether he believes they can hear him, or whether he just enjoys the performance. Either way, no one volunteers to fact-check. You start keeping track of his moods like a scholar. Yesterday, benevolent tyrant. Today, storm with human privileges. The palace gossips call it divine inspiration. You call it Tuesday. By sunset, the day might end with music, wine, and laughter, or with guards dragging someone away for breathing suspiciously. You stop predicting outcomes. The only constant in Caligula's moods is that they always have victims. And as you extinguish your lamp each night, you whisper the same prayer everyone in the palace knows by heart. Please, Jupiter, let him be bored tomorrow. You start to suspect the emperor doesn't sleep because he's afraid the gods might hold a meeting without him. For everyone else, this means nights are optional. The palace never truly goes dark. Torches burn along the corridors, casting shadows that look suspiciously like people you owe apologies to. Somewhere down the hall, someone's always awake, guards whispering, servants pacing, courtiers pretending to read poetry they can't see in the dim light. The emperor's schedule obeys no mortal clock. You could be summoned at dawn, dismissed at noon, then called again at midnight because he's decided the stars are applauding him and someone should witness it. When a messenger knocks on your door after sunset, you don't ask why. You just go. Refusing an invitation from a god is a health hazard. The palace at night feels alive, and not in a comforting way. You pass the kitchens where exhausted cooks stare into pots like philosophers searching for meaning. You glimpse musicians tuning their lyres in silence, hoping they're not being summoned for another improvised hymn. Every face carries the same expression, polite despair. When you finally see Caligula, he's usually pacing barefoot across marble floors, wrapped in a robe that might cost more than a villa. He talks to everyone and no one. Sometimes he recites verses, sometimes arguments, occasionally both. You nod when appropriate and pray he's addressing the air and not you. He loves these midnight sessions. "The moon understands me," he once says, staring out the window. You agree instantly. "Of course, Caesar." He narrows his eyes. "You mock me." You panic. "Never." He smiles. "Good. Then you'll stay until dawn to make sure she keeps listening." You do. The moon doesn't. By the time morning comes, you've learned that night in Caligula's palace isn't a time. It's an endurance event. Sleep is a myth, like honesty or reasonable emperors. When you finally collapse into bed, you hear footsteps again. Another summons, another performance. You laugh quietly to yourself, because at this point, what else is there to do? In Caligula's world, even exhaustion is a privilege. And you, lucky you, are very privileged indeed. It takes exactly one mistake to understand how things work in Caligula's palace. Not your mistake, thankfully, someone else's. You just happen to be standing close enough to learn the lesson vicariously, which is the safest way to learn anything around here. It starts innocently enough. A servant forgets to respond quickly when the emperor speaks. A full second passes, maybe two. In normal human time, that's negligible. In divine time, it's treason. The air freezes. Caligula tilts his head like a curious bird. The room goes silent, except for the sound of everyone collectively holding their breath. The servant stammers, apologizes, drops to their knees. Caligula smiles, not kindly, but as if he's just remembered something amusing from childhood. Then, in the same calm tone one might use to order bread, he tells a guard to remove the hesitation. No one moves for a heartbeat. Then they do. You don't look. You don't need to. The message is clear. Hesitation equals rebellion. Speech equals risk. Breathing is tolerated, for now. After that, the rules feel much simpler. When Caligula laughs, you laugh. When he cries, you cry. When he stares into space, you stare too, in case the space is looking back. You become fluent in survival. Every nod, bow and word rehearsed like lines from a tragedy you didn't audition for. Punishments vary depending on his mood. Sometimes it's public humiliation, sometimes banishment, sometimes a stern lecture about loyalty to divinity, which is somehow worse. You begin to notice that fear is the palace's true architecture, not marble, not gold, but pure, efficient anxiety. One evening, Caligula catches a senator yawning during dinner. The room stops breathing. The emperor asks him gently, "Am I boring you?" The senator insists no. He was just overwhelmed by Caesar's brilliance. Caligula nods slowly, then orders everyone else to yawn too. "If he's tired," he says, "then we should all be tired." You stand there, yawning obediently, wondering if this counts as unity or insanity. Probably both. When the night finally ends, you realize that disobedience in Caligula's Rome isn't just punished, it's choreographed. Everyone learns the steps eventually. Those who don't, stop dancing. Caligula doesn't just rule Rome, he directs it. And the palace? It's his stage. Everyone inside has a role, whether they like it or not. You, unfortunately, are part of the supporting cast. The tragedy is that there's no script, only improvisation and fear. The emperor adores performance. Music, poetry, speeches. But most of all, drama. He once said, "The people love theatre, so let them have it." He forgot to mention that his favourite plays are unscripted, and the actors are real. You witness one of his productions firsthand. The atrium is transformed into a makeshift theatre. Cushions for nobles, torches for mood lighting, and a platform where servants like you are told to recreate the glory of Rome. There's no rehearsal. There's no direction. Just Caligula sitting front row, smiling like an artist who knows chaos is art. The show begins. Someone recites a poem. Someone else pretends to be a general giving orders to invisible soldiers. Then Caligula interrupts, waving his hand. "Too dull," he declares. "Let's make it realistic." He starts assigning parts. Senators as soldiers, servants as enemies, and a few unfortunate souls as traitors. You quickly understand the rule. Realism means suffering, and applause is mandatory. The audience laughs nervously. A senator trips over his own robe. The crowd roars with exaggerated joy. Caligula beams, convinced he's created the next great Roman masterpiece. You stand there, frozen in the torchlight, hoping your turn never comes. When it does, he points to you. "Be a messenger of the gods," he says. You nod, though you have no idea what that means. "Deliver the message," he commands. You improvise something vague about destiny and Rome's greatness. He claps. You survive. Afterward, the nobles cheer. The emperor calls it a triumph of art and divine imagination. You call it Tuesday night. The torches burn low, and the scent of fear lingers longer than the wine. When the audience finally leaves, the servants clean the floor in silence. One mutters, "He should charge admission." Another replies, "He already does. We just pay in nerves." You don't laugh. You're too busy memorizing every rule of his theatre. Because in Caligula's Rome, survival is the performance, and the show never ends. By now, Caligula has stopped pretending to be merely emperor. Mortals, after all, have limits. And limits are something he's been allergic to since birth. One morning, he wakes up and decides he's divine. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. The transition happens smoothly, like a bad policy no one dares question. Priests begin their mornings by saluting his statue. Courtiers sprinkle compliments like holy water. You learn to refer to him not as Caesar, but as our Lord of all things, including the weather. Temples once dedicated to Jupiter are redecorated with Caligula's face, which is awkward since Jupiter's beard was more flattering. Sculptors work through the night, chiseling divine cheekbones under strict supervision. If a statue doesn't capture his essence, the sculptor gets reassigned to non-creative duties. Nobody asks what those are. You're forced to attend ceremonies in his honor. The rituals are confusing, mostly because they're invented on the spot. Caligula stands on an altar surrounded by incense, declaring himself equal to the stars. Someone faints. He takes it as worship. He also begins communicating directly with the gods. Or so he claims. Sometimes he talks to the moon, other nights to his reflection. You've seen him lecture a column for interrupting. The column took it well. At meals, he demands to be treated as a celestial being. Guests must praise the divine flavor of his bread or risk divine consequences. Once, he declares that anyone eating beside him should also consume gold leaf to purify the soul. You chew your portion carefully, trying not to chip a tooth on your spirituality. The Senate, naturally, agrees with everything. They draft decrees confirming his immortality, mostly to avoid testing it themselves. You begin to suspect that divinity, in Rome, is less about faith and more about self-confidence with excellent branding. Still, the transformation changes the palace. Everything becomes ceremonial, sacred, and slightly ridiculous. Even daily greetings start sounding like hymns. You whisper, "Good morning," and someone corrects you. It's blessed dawn under Caesar's eternal light. You nod solemnly, because in Caligula's empire, irony is illegal, and enthusiasm is survival. And as you kneel before a man in sandals who thinks he controls the sun, you realize the truth. He doesn't act like a god because he's mad. He acts like a god because no one remembers what sanity looks like anymore. By now, the palace doesn't feel like a building. It feels like a rumor you can walk through. The marble gleams, the fountains sing, the statues stare heroically into the distance. But beneath the shine, there's something rotten humming in the walls. Fear. Real, old-fashioned Roman fear. You can sense it in the way people move. Courtiers glide instead of walking, as if sudden motion might attract divine attention. Senators whisper in corners, inventing new ways to sound loyal without accidentally saying anything meaningful. Even the guards have developed a kind of polite invisibility. You start to think that in Caligula's palace, invisibility isn't just useful. It's an art form. You've learned to listen more than you speak. The gossip here isn't casual. It's intelligence work. One wrong word can travel faster than plague. A compliment can be mistaken for sarcasm. Silence can be mistaken for plotting. You perfect a new conversational style, the nod and smile. It means nothing, which makes it perfectly safe. Everyone is pretending all the time. The senators pretend to respect him, the generals pretend to obey him, and Caligula pretends not to notice that everyone's pretending. It's an exhausting circle of performance, but the alternative involves considerably more swords. The palace feels heavier every day. The laughter sounds forced, the music off-key, and even the gold looks tired. You can't remember when anyone last spoke freely. The walls themselves seem to listen. Rumour has it the emperor had listening holes carved behind frescoes so he could eavesdrop. Or maybe he just told people that, so they'd police themselves. Either way, it worked. You start having dreams where you're speaking too loudly. You wake up sweating, apologizing to the darkness. There's comfort in knowing you're not alone. Everyone's terrified in perfect synchrony. It's practically team spirit. Sometimes you catch your reflection in polished marble and hardly recognize yourself. You've learned the palace posture. Straight spine, careful smile, eyes that reveal nothing except mild admiration. It's the look of someone who intends to survive the week. And you just might. Because in Caligula's Rome, bravery doesn't mean facing lions. It means showing up to work, keeping your head down, and pretending marble doesn't echo the sound of your heartbeat. It begins like any other morning in Caligula's palace, which is to say confusing, loud, and mildly apocalyptic. The emperor is in high spirits, which usually means low survival odds for everyone else. You're polishing something shiny, pretending to look busy, when the rumor starts sliding through the corridors like spilled wine. The emperor's been attacked. At first, no one believes it. Caligula, attacked? Impossible. Gods don't get attacked. They get worshipped, flattered, and occasionally questioned, briefly, before being replaced. You assume it's another of his tests, one of those theatrical stunts he enjoys so much. But then you notice the silence. Real silence. The kind that doesn't happen in Rome unless something enormous has gone wrong. You follow the hush down the hallway, where guards are standing awkwardly. Too still, too pale. The scent of iron hangs in the air. The great marble corridor that once echoed with orders and laughter now echoes with nothing at all. Someone whispers, "It's true. The god bleeds." And suddenly, Rome changes. You catch glimpses through doorways, shattered cups, crimson footprints, a robe abandoned like a fallen flag. The Praetorian guards, his own protectors, are the ones who did it. They say 30 blades struck him, but rumor always exaggerates. Either way, divinity didn't help. It turns out gods look surprisingly mortal when stabbed enough times. The senators don't cheer, not yet. They just look at one another like gamblers realizing the house finally lost. The servants freeze, unsure whether to mourn or celebrate. You stand there, still holding a silver tray, thinking, so that's it. That's how empires change. Not with thunder, but with quiet footsteps and bad planning. The chaos builds fast. Orders fly through the palace, some to burn evidence, others to protect it. Everyone tries to remember which side they were on this morning. You try to remember if you've ever said anything flattering enough to qualify as loyal. Probably not. You pass one of his golden statues on the way out. Its face looks serene, as if still expecting applause. You almost feel sorry for it. For the first time, Rome's most feared man is silent. And in that silence, you realize something strange. The palace finally feels human again. The morning after Caligula's death feels wrong. Not because he's gone, but because the world is still here. The sun rises, the fountains still run, and the palace smells of incense and panic. You'd expected trumpets, thunder, or divine retribution. Instead, there's just an awkward, collective silence. The kind that happens when everyone realizes they've accidentally survived. The guards are gone, the senators are whispering, and the servants are pretending to clean while carefully not looking at the blood being scrubbed from the marble. For the first time, you can breathe, and it feels suspicious. You half expect him to walk around the corner, grinning, declaring the entire assassination a morality play. You'd even applaud, out of habit, but he doesn't. The god is dead, and what's left is paperwork. The palace, once the loudest place in Rome, has gone strangely still. The torches burn low, the laughter is gone, even the statues look relieved. Some slaves run, others freeze, unsure if freedom is a trap. You stand in the courtyard, the morning light reflecting off gold tiles, and wonder what to do with yourself now that no one is telling you what to fear. Outside the palace, Rome is already rewriting the story. Some call him a monster, others a misunderstood genius, and a few quietly ask if they can have their stolen villas back. History, you realize, is less about truth and more about timing, and Caligula ran out of both. You find Domna, the woman who trained you to survive this madness, packing her few belongings into a cloth bundle. "It's over," you say. She doesn't look up. "Nothing's over," she replies. "Rome just changes the name of the fear." She's right, of course. Freedom in Rome doesn't mean safety. It means uncertainty with better scenery. Still, you step outside the palace gates for the first time in months, and the sunlight feels different. Lighter. Real. You're not free from the empire, but you're free from its cruelest god. You turn back once, looking at the marble monument that consumed so many lives. It's beautiful, horrifying, and quiet. For the first time, truly quiet. And in that silence you realize you've survived history. In Florence, power did not rise from cathedrals or council halls. It began in the bedroom. The Medici, masters of both money and manipulation, understood something far deeper than economics. Desire was the most reliable currency in the world. Long before they ruled Tuscany, they ruled whispers. They knew that a scandal, properly controlled, could elevate a name faster than any banker's ledger or papal blessing. And within the perfumed chambers of Palazzo Medici, love, lust, and ambition merged into one unstoppable force. Cosimo de' Medici, the dynasty's founding patriarch, cultivated respect in public and influence in private. To the church, he was a pious benefactor. To Florence, a shrewd financier. But behind closed doors, his family's survival depended on strategic seductions, carefully chosen mistresses, and discreet arrangements that tied noble families together through flesh as much as faith. The Medici didn't simply marry for alliances. They seduced for information, bought loyalty with affection, and used beauty as their hidden weapon. By the time Lorenzo the Magnificent inherited this legacy, Florence itself had become a theatre of passion. Artists painted Madonnas, while courtiers whispered about mistresses. Priests blessed marriages during the day, then confessed to sins of the flesh by night. In this world, hypocrisy wasn't a flaw, it was policy. Every liaison had a purpose, every affair a shadow agenda. The Medici made sure of it. Mistresses became ambassadors. Illegitimate children became diplomatic gifts. A lover's betrayal could destroy a rival's reputation faster than poison. Even the Vatican, supposedly a bastion of virtue, was not immune. The Medici courted cardinals with the same skill they used to seduce duchesses. Florence's moralists condemned them from the pulpit, yet those same preachers dined on Medici gold and secretly envied their influence. The city's gossip mills turned their escapades into legend. But to the Medici, reputation wasn't something to protect. It was something to weaponize. A public scandal, if well timed, could distract enemies, redirect attention, or even earn sympathy. Sex was never just pleasure. It was a transaction, a negotiation, a chess move, and the Medici played it better than anyone. In Florence, where beauty and power were inseparable, the bedroom became the true throne room of the Renaissance. When Lorenzo de' Medici married Clarice Orsini in 1469, Florence expected a union of virtue and grace, a pious noblewoman from Rome, bound to its most brilliant patron. But behind the carefully staged wedding feast and the golden procession through the city, the truth was far more strategic. Lorenzo hadn't married for love, he married for leverage. The Orsini family brought ancient prestige and papal favour, the kind of influence the Medici could never buy with florins alone. In Renaissance politics, marriage wasn't sacred. It was a contract inked in perfume and deceit. Clarice Orsini, raised in a convent and trained in obedience, soon discovered that her husband's affection was divided between her and Florence itself. Lorenzo's mistress, Lucrezia Donati, was the city's most whispered-about woman. Her beauty was immortalized by poets and painters, but her true power lay in her proximity to the magnificent. Letters between them hinted at tenderness, but also at manipulation. For Lorenzo, love was an art form, one that could soften rivals, flatter enemies, and inspire loyalty. Clarice endured it all in silence. In public, she played the devoted wife, hosting religious feasts and shielding the family's image of virtue. Behind the scenes, she wielded her own quiet power, writing letters to Rome, currying favour with bishops, and ensuring the Medici name remained respectable even when her husband's desires strayed. Her restraint, her piety, became another Medici weapon. While Lorenzo seduced Florence, Clarice seduced the church. Their household reflected this duality, half monastery, half masquerade. Priests dined alongside poets, nuns whispered confessions to courtesans. The walls of Palazzo Medici echoed with madrigals, debates, and secrets. Florence adored Lorenzo's charisma, but trusted Clarice's morality. Together, they formed a paradox the city couldn't look away from: the magnificent sinner and the sanctified wife. When foreign ambassadors came to dine, they weren't just observing Renaissance hospitality, they were watching theatre. Lorenzo's charm disarmed, Clarice's composure reassured, and both concealed the cracks in the Medici facade. Their marriage wasn't just a union, it was performance politics. And every touch, every smile, every carefully staged scandal served a purpose. In the Medici world, love was never blind. It saw everything, calculated everything, and left no passion unused in the pursuit of power. If Clarice Orsini represented the Medici's mask of virtue, their mistresses embodied the family's hidden machinery of persuasion. In Florence, beauty was a form of currency, and the women who possessed it could alter the course of politics as easily as a banker shifted gold. Every Medici man had a mistress, and almost every mistress had a purpose. They weren't mere lovers. They were diplomats in disguise, instruments of flattery and espionage wrapped in silk. The most infamous among them was Lucrezia Donati, Lorenzo the Magnificent's muse and emotional confidant. She inspired poems that circulated through Florence like wildfire, elevating Lorenzo's image as the Renaissance ideal of passion and refinement. Yet her true value lay beyond romance. Lucrezia acted as a political buffer, softening the egos of noblemen who envied Lorenzo's rise. At banquets, her laughter could dissolve tension faster than any treaty. Her affection wasn't a secret, it was strategy, and Florence adored the spectacle. Then there was Simonetta Vespucci, the radiant muse immortalized by Botticelli's brush. Though not a Medici mistress herself, she moved within their circles, where beauty blurred into propaganda. Paintings of her divine form weren't mere art. They were subtle endorsements of Medici taste and cultural dominance. The family understood the optics. By surrounding themselves with beauty, they appeared destined for greatness. Desire became their halo. Even lesser-known lovers played critical roles. Through discreet pillow talk, the Medici gathered gossip from rival houses, bishops, and even cardinals. Their women became the unseen couriers of state secrets, smuggling influence through affection. A whispered promise in the dark could be worth more than a papal decree. But this sensual diplomacy had consequences. As Florence grew obsessed with its ruling family's indulgence, moral backlash stirred. The Dominican preacher Savonarola thundered from the pulpit, denouncing the Medici's courts of sin, warning that God would not be mocked by flesh and vanity. His sermons turned lovers' whispers into weapons. Still, the Medici did not retreat. They knew the truth. Power required both saints and sinners. Their mistresses might have tarnished reputations, but they also built empires. Through them, the family controlled hearts, alliances, and narratives. For the Medici, pleasure was never private. It was public policy, painted in flesh tones and sealed with a kiss. In most noble houses, an illegitimate child was a stain to be erased. But for the Medici, bastards were assets. Every child, legitimate or not, could be moulded into a political tool. Their bloodlines were less about purity and more about potential. In a world where alliances shifted with every papal whisper, even the so-called wrong sons and daughters could be turned into pawns in the Medici's sprawling chess game of power. Cosimo de' Medici had set the precedent. Family came first, but only if it served the dynasty. By Lorenzo the Magnificent's time, this unwritten rule had evolved into strategy. Illegitimate sons were placed in the clergy, groomed for cardinal hats, or sent to manage distant estates where their loyalty would strengthen Medici reach. The women were married off to lesser nobles, ensuring that even distant cousins of the family carried Medici blood and influence into other courts. One of the most striking examples came later, with Giulio de' Medici, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo's brother, Giuliano. Born from a fleeting affair with a woman of uncertain origin, Giulio could have been discarded as a family embarrassment. Instead, he was raised under the family's wing, educated among princes, and eventually ascended to the papacy as Pope Clement VII. It was the ultimate proof that for the Medici, sin could be sanctified if it was useful. Florence, ever the gossiping city, was fascinated. The Medici didn't hide their bastards. They elevated them. Artists painted them, poets praised them, and chroniclers pretended not to see the scandal. The people admired this brazenness, perhaps even envied it. In a world of strict morality, the Medici flaunted their defiance and somehow made it look divine. Of course, the church squirmed. Popes and bishops publicly condemned their unholy unions, yet secretly courted Medici favour. Gold and influence, after all, were as redeeming as confession. When Giulio became pope, Rome itself bowed to the irony, a bastard ruling the church that once damned his birth. By weaponizing illegitimacy, the Medici redefined inheritance itself. They transformed shame into opportunity, weakness into legacy. Each child, no matter their origin, became a thread in the golden fabric of Medici power, and behind every papal robe or marriage alliance was a reminder that the Medici's true faith was not in God, but in the endurance of their blood. By the early 16th century, the Medici had conquered every room of power, from the banks of Florence to the altars of Rome. And yet their true battleground remained the same, the bedchamber. Nowhere did their blend of lust and strategy shine brighter than in the Vatican itself. When Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X, the world expected reform. What it got instead was a masquerade of indulgence that blurred the line between divine authority and earthly desire. Leo X, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, carried into the papacy the same taste for pleasure that had defined his family. Banquets turned into orgies of wealth, golden dishes, exotic dancers, and fountains flowing with wine. The Vatican under the Medici resembled less a monastery and more a Florentine carnival. Whispers of affairs between priests and noblewomen spread like incense through Rome's corridors, and though Leo himself remained discreet, his household was a playground of favoritism and seduction. But the scandal didn't end with Leo. His cousin, Giulio de' Medici, later Pope Clement VII, brought his own complications to the Holy See. Giulio's illegitimacy already raised eyebrows, but it was his rumoured entanglements with widowed noblewomen that fueled gossip. Rome, ever hungry for hypocrisy, delighted in the irony of bastards wearing papal robes while preaching chastity. The Medici had turned sin into sacrament, transforming their family's sensual history into a divine right to rule. Even the papal appointments carried the fingerprints of seduction. Courtiers whispered that certain cardinals owed their red hats not to piety, but to the pillow talk of well-placed mistresses who whispered the Medici name into the right ears. Power, influence, and flesh had become indistinguishable. Outside Rome, reformers fumed. Martin Luther called the Medici popes brothel keepers in holy garb, fueling the Protestant fire. Yet within Italy, their charisma was unshakable. Artists like Raphael and Michelangelo thrived under their patronage, immortalizing their splendor in fresco and marble. The irony was perfect. Beauty sanctified corruption. The Medici didn't just blur the boundary between sacred and profane. They erased it. Their reign proved that even in the heart of Christendom, the truest confessions of power were whispered not in prayer but in passion. At the Medici court, power wasn't displayed through crowns or swords. It shimmered through satin gowns, jewelled hairpins, and the soft laughter of courtesans. Florence under Medici rule had become a living theatre of temptation, where politics and pleasure performed on the same stage. Every banquet, every dance, every carefully timed smile had meaning. And no one understood this delicate choreography better than the courtiers and courtesans, who revolved around the family like planets around the sun. In the salons of Palazzo Pitti and the gardens of Boboli, courtesans became instruments of persuasion. They gathered secrets from drunk nobles, softened hard bargains, and flattered the egos of men twice their age. Some were artists in disguise, women who composed sonnets and discussed philosophy while simultaneously spying for their Medici patrons. Beauty was their weapon, and discretion their armour. They were the invisible thread stitching together Florence's alliances. Among the most notable was Tullia d'Aragona, a poet and intellectual courtesan whose conversations could charm scholars and scandalise priests. Her wit drew the attention of Medici men, and her salon became a magnet for thinkers, diplomats, and opportunists. To the Medici, such women weren't threats, they were tools. Each could sway a decision, shape a rumour, or disarm an enemy over a cup of sweet wine. Male courtiers were no less complicit. They flattered mistresses, brokered introductions, and even arranged trysts that served political ends. Behind every diplomatic success lay a trail of flirtations and favours. A whisper in a bedroom could change the fate of entire provinces. The Medici turned social grace into governance, proving that charm could be as lethal as steel, but the cost of this gilded seduction was high. Reputations shattered overnight, jealousy fueled vendettas, and a single rumour could ruin a family. Florentine mothers warned their daughters never fall in love with a Medici. Yet many did, because to be chosen by one meant a brief taste of immortality. In the end, these courtiers and courtesans formed a silent empire of influence, woven through sheets and soirees. They were the Medici's unofficial diplomats, wielding intimacy where armies could not tread. Theirs was the soft power of the Renaissance, dangerous, intoxicating, and utterly indispensable to the dynasty that ruled through both gold and desire. For the Medici, reputation was a weapon sharper than any dagger. Florence's crowded streets buzzed with gossip, and every rumour, true or false, had the potential to crown or crush a dynasty. The Medici mastered this invisible battlefield, manipulating public perception as skillfully as they managed their banks. To them, scandal wasn't a problem to avoid, it was a tool to control. Lorenzo the Magnificent had taught his heirs that image meant survival. The family's reputation as patrons of the arts and defenders of the faith acted as a smokescreen for their private debauchery. They funded monasteries and painters, while their mistresses flaunted jewels purchased with church tithes. To the people, the Medici were gods in human form, flawed perhaps, but divine in their grandeur. And when moralists dared to question them, the family countered with displays of piety and charity. A new church here, a hospital there, and the whispers vanished into hymns. Yet not all scandals could be buried under marble. When Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici was accused of fathering a child, the Vatican held its breath. Rather than deny the claim, the family spun it into legend. Even the holiest men, their allies said, cannot resist the fire of Florence. What could have been ruin turned into myth, a tale of virility mistaken for sin. This manipulation of narrative became an art form. The Medici controlled poets, painters, and chroniclers, commissioning works that portrayed them as noble, merciful, and chosen by God. Their portraits radiated restraint, even when their lives reeked of excess. Florence's artists didn't just decorate their walls, they sculpted their reputations. Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Ghirlandaio transformed their clients' sins into symbols of grace. But reputation was a double-edged sword. When moral fury finally found its voice in the preacher Savonarola, the Medici's illusion cracked. He thundered against their courts of lust and the satanic pomp of false princes. The people listened. Bonfires consumed paintings, perfumes, and poetry. Everything that once glorified Medici sensuality. For the first time, the family realized that control over reputation was never absolute. They had ruled through beauty, desire, and spectacle. But Florence's love was fickle. The same crowd that once adored their elegance could, with equal passion, condemn it. And so, the Medici learned a bitter truth. In a city built on image, the most dangerous sin was being seen too clearly. By the late Renaissance, the Medici had perfected a skill no army could match, turning love itself into a weapon of diplomacy. Every kiss, every marriage, every discreet affair was calculated for advantage. In their world, affection was never private. It was political currency. Florence might have been ruled from the Palazzo Pitti, but its fate was often decided in bedchambers draped with velvet and secrets. Catherine de' Medici, perhaps the family's greatest political prodigy, carried this philosophy to France. Married to King Henry II, she arrived in Paris as an Italian outsider, mocked for her accent and her modest dowry. But Catherine was a Medici. She knew that power was rarely inherited. It was seduced. While her husband's heart belonged to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, Catherine played a longer game. She endured humiliation with a smile, biding her time, studying her rivals. When Henry died, Catherine's patience paid off. As Queen Mother, she wielded power through her sons, her daughters, and a network of calculated marriages. She turned her children into political arrows, marrying them into the ruling houses of Spain, Austria, and the German principalities. Her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, became infamous for her beauty and her lovers. But every one of those relationships fed Catherine's web of influence. Even scandal served her purpose. France whispered her name with fear and fascination, and that was enough. The Medici understood that emotional loyalty could achieve what treaties could not. A mistress might charm a general into hesitation. A marriage might silence a rival faction. A love affair might buy months of peace. Their diplomacy was carnal, subtle, and brilliantly effective. In Florence, too, the same game continued. Marriages were arranged not for romance, but for leverage. Daughters became dowry bearers, sons became seducers, and every liaison was recorded like an entry in the family ledger. Even heartbreak was valuable, if it could be turned into sympathy or legend. Where other dynasties built fortresses, the Medici built relationships, delicate, seductive, and binding. They understood that passion could rule men more absolutely than law or faith. For them, diplomacy was not conducted at a table of parchment and quills, but whispered in the dark between lovers who mistook desire for destiny. And in that confusion, the Medici always won. By the end of their reign, the Medici had rewritten the meaning of power in Europe. They proved that politics was not confined to the battlefield or the throne room. It pulsed through bedrooms, salons, and confessionals. Their scandals became their signatures, their lovers, their legacies. Even when their wealth began to wane, the myth of their sensual genius endured. No other dynasty had so effectively transformed human weakness, lust, vanity, ambition, into a governing philosophy. Florence itself had become their reflection. Beautiful, contradictory, and morally flexible. Churches stood beside brothels financed by Medici gold. Painters captured angels while sleeping with their patrons' muses. The city that once judged its rulers now lived by their rules, where sin was sophistication and reputation was art. The Medici didn't just rule Florence, they seduced it. Catherine de' Medici's descendants spread this legacy across Europe, turning royal courts into theatres of intrigue. Her granddaughters and nieces, each bearing the blood of Florence, continued the family's art of influence through marriage and manipulation. In France, they mastered courtly love as politics. In Rome, they clothed corruption in velvet and incense. Even in decline, the Medici name carried a faint perfume of danger and allure. But the price of power through passion was steep. Generations of deceit, jealousy, and betrayal left the family hollow. By the 17th century, the Medici line was a shadow of its former self, rich in titles, poor in vitality. Their salons still glittered, but the spark that once ignited Europe's imagination had dimmed. Love, once their weapon, had turned against them. The family became trapped in its own myth, enslaved by the very seductions that had built its empire, and yet, centuries later, their influence lingers. Every Renaissance painting of a half-clothed Venus, every palace built to impress a lover, every political marriage whispered in secrecy owes something to the Medici. They taught Europe that the body could be as powerful as the sword, that desire could govern nations, and that image could outlive morality. In the end, their true legacy wasn't their art or their fortune. It was their understanding of humanity. They saw that beneath every crown and robe beats the same heart, ambitious, restless, and ruled by desire. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous truth the Medici ever revealed. In the glittering courts of medieval Europe, pets were far more than companions. They were social statements. To own a creature that served no practical purpose was to announce one's power, wealth, and refinement. Where peasants kept oxen for ploughing and cats for pest control, nobles surrounded themselves with animals bred purely for beauty, loyalty, or exotic allure. A nobleman's hound, a lady's lapdog, or a parrot from distant islands wasn't simply loved. It was paraded, painted, and often pampered like royalty itself. The noble household was alive with fur, feathers, and the echoes of pride. Greyhounds, lean and regal, were the favourite companions of kings and knights alike. Their speed symbolised nobility's own ambition, swift, elegant, untouchable. They dined on bread soaked in milk, slept on velvet cushions, and wore collars of silver and enamel. To see a lord without his hound was as strange as to see him without his sword. These dogs were living emblems of aristocracy, trained not only for the hunt, but to display grace beside their masters in portraits and feasts. For noble women, smaller dogs were the fashion of affection. Italian greyhounds, spaniels, and toy breeds nestled in silken laps and appeared in love poems as symbols of fidelity and tenderness. When a lady wept, her dog was allowed to share her tears. When she died, her portrait often included the same faithful creature resting beside her tomb. In a society that prized control and appearance, these animals were one of the few acceptable outlets for genuine emotion. Beyond dogs, the rare and exotic defined elite tastes. Monkeys arrived from Africa and parrots from the Levant, carried along trade routes that only the rich could afford. They fascinated the medieval imagination. A monkey in a jewelled harness could amuse guests or scandalise priests who saw in its mimicry a reflection of human sin. Meanwhile, cats, often maligned by superstition, found safe haven in monasteries and noble libraries, where they guarded manuscripts from mice. Even they, in some households, wore tiny bells to signify ownership and status. In the medieval mind, to command the loyalty of beasts was to mirror divine order itself. The nobility saw their pets as reflections of heaven's hierarchy, obedient, elegant, and entirely devoted to those born to rule. Among all the creatures that graced the halls of medieval nobility, none held a higher rank than the greyhound. Sleek, swift, and impossibly elegant, it was not merely a hunting dog, it was a symbol of lineage. To the medieval mind, the greyhound embodied every quality a noble should possess: loyalty, courage, restraint, and grace. The saying went, "Gentlemen are known by their hawks, their horses, and their hounds." And no hound spoke louder of refinement than this one. Hunting was the theatre of nobility, and the greyhound was its star. These dogs were bred for the chase, not the kill. Their purpose was not to tear flesh, but to run with breathtaking speed, their bodies stretched like arrows across the fields. A nobleman would ride out at dawn, his retinue behind him, with his greyhounds running before the horses, each motion a display of wealth and discipline. The kill itself was secondary. The spectacle of control, coordination, and breeding was what truly mattered. But the greyhound's prestige extended far beyond the hunt. They followed their masters into halls, chapels, and even courts. Monarchs were painted with greyhounds at their feet, their lean forms a silent testament to nobility and virtue. The dog's loyalty became metaphorical, knighthood embodied in fur. It was said that a greyhound would starve beside its master's grave rather than seek a new hand to feed it. In life and in death, the dog's devotion mirrored the chivalric ideals of service and faithfulness. Sumptuous care reflected their elevated status. They dined better than most peasants, fed roasted meats, white bread, and cream. Their collars were embroidered with pearls and silver thread, often bearing the family crest. It was not uncommon for a noblewoman to commission a miniature portrait of her favourite greyhound, or to have its likeness carved into her tomb. Even religion gave the animal its due. In medieval bestiaries, Greyhounds were used as allegories for the soul's pursuit of righteousness, forever chasing the divine. To harm one was not merely an insult to a nobleman, it was a social crime, punishable by heavy fines or even imprisonment. To own a greyhound was to possess motion made noble, a living reminder that even in an age of swords and sanctity, elegance could still run on four legs. If the greyhound was the nobleman's pride, the lapdog was the noblewoman's heart. In castles scented with incense and lavender, these tiny creatures were more than companions. They were extensions of grace and gentility. Small enough to fit in a sleeve or rest on a cushion, they lived lives of luxury that rivaled their mistresses. To cradle one in your arms was to signal refinement, sensitivity, and delicate breeding, the very virtues that defined high-born femininity in the medieval world. The breeds most adored were spaniels, toy poodles, and Italian greyhounds, each chosen for its beauty, obedience, and docile temperament. They were bred to sit quietly in chambers while their owners embroidered or read prayers, to warm cold hands in draughty manners, and to entertain guests with their delicate tricks. Chroniclers noted that noblewomen even took them to bed to ward off chills. Physicians of the time encouraged the practice, claiming that the gentle warmth of a dog's body could draw illness away, a superstition that gave comfort a scientific excuse. But the lapdog's importance wasn't just domestic, it was social theatre. A lady's pet reflected her personality. The gentlewoman who carried a calm, elegant dog was seen as virtuous. The one who spoiled a yapping, overfed companion risked mockery. At court, dogs were dressed in ribbons, tiny bells, and sometimes even miniature velvet garments. A lady arriving at a feast with her lapdog perched in her arms was making a statement of wealth more subtle and more charming than any jewel she wore. Some dogs became famous in their own right. Queen Isabella of Castile's little spaniels accompanied her on campaign, and King Charles's beloved toy breeds later inspired an entire lineage named after him. When a lady's dog died, its passing was mourned with genuine tears. Some were buried in miniature coffins or depicted in memorial paintings at their mistress's feet, symbols of love, loyalty, and status that even death couldn't erase. Poets, too, saw lapdogs as metaphors for devotion. In courtly love, they represented perfect obedience, a living reminder that affection, like nobility, demanded discipline. To the medieval lady, her pet was not simply a plaything, but a trusted confidant in a gilded cage of etiquette. Small, silent, and endlessly faithful, the lapdog ruled the private world of women just as the greyhound ruled the fields of men. If the lapdog ruled the boudoir, the falcon ruled the sky. No symbol of nobility was more prestigious or more perilous than the art of falconry. It was not merely a sport, it was a ritual of power, patience, and mastery over nature. A nobleman's worth was often judged by his skill in commanding these fierce, beautiful creatures. The falcon was the living embodiment of control, wildness tamed by aristocratic will. Every social rank had its bird. Kings and emperors flew gerfalcons, the largest and rarest of all, imported at great expense from the Arctic. Dukes and earls might keep peregrines, while lower nobles handled kestrels or merlins. The rules were so strict that manuals were written to define who could own what. To possess a bird above one's station was considered an act of arrogance, a breach of the social order itself. But for those entitled, falconry was a mark of refinement. The training of a hawk required gentleness, endurance, and a steady hand, qualities seen as noble in both man and beast. A falconer's life was one of intimacy and ritual. The bird ate from his hand, slept in his chamber, and rode on his wrist, hooded in leather trimmed with gold. Some nobles spoke to their hawks as equals, believing them to possess almost human understanding. They were fed delicacies, raw meat soaked in wine, and treated by specialized veterinarians called Austringers. When sick, they were prayed for, as though they were knights fallen in battle. The spectacle of a falcon returning from the sky to its master's call was a deeply political image. Monarchs staged hunts as public performances of divine authority. When a king extended his arm and the bird landed, it symbolized the universe itself, yielding to his command. The falcon became a metaphor for disciplined power, majestic yet obedient, wild yet loyal. Even noble women partook in the art. Queens and duchesses were often painted with small merlins on their wrists, proof that grace and dominance could coexist. A falcon on a lady's arm told the world she possessed courage beneath her silks. In a realm where every gesture was steeped in meaning, the falcon stood above all, a living crown, soaring proof that the nobility could command even the wind. While hounds and falcons embodied the virtues of Europe, the true measure of a noble's curiosity and wealth lay in the exotic creatures they imported from distant lands. To own a monkey or a parrot in the medieval world was to possess a living miracle. These animals were proof that one's influence extended beyond the known world, touching the mysterious realms of Africa, India, and the East. Monkeys were especially fashionable among the aristocracy of the 15th century. They were mischievous, clever, and irreverently human, qualities that both amused and disturbed medieval sensibilities. In a time when order and hierarchy defined existence, the monkey was chaos incarnate, a parody of man himself. In illuminated manuscripts, they often appeared dressed in tiny clothes, pouring wine, stealing fruit, or mocking priests. Yet the wealthy adored them for precisely that reason. A noble's monkey could shock dinner guests, entertain a bored duchess, or even mock a rival without consequence. In an age obsessed with etiquette, monkeys offered the forbidden delight of disorder. Parrots, meanwhile, were creatures of wonder. Their dazzling colours and strange voices made them prized possessions in royal courts. Imported through Venice and the Middle East, they were gifts exchanged among kings and popes. The bird's ability to mimic speech gave it an almost magical reputation. Some clerics whispered that parrots repeated prayers, others warned that they echoed sins. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine was said to have owned a green parrot that could speak Latin greetings to visiting dignitaries, leaving them speechless. These animals required constant care and attention. Exotic birds were kept in heated chambers, their diets including nuts, honey, and imported fruits. Monkeys wore golden chains and sometimes jeweled collars, sitting on cushions beside their owners. Artists of the period captured them frequently, not as pets, but as moral symbols, the monkey representing sin and temptation, the parrot purity and paradise. To have both in one household was to flaunt mastery over virtue and vice alike. Such creatures were conversation pieces, luxuries that merged entertainment with theology. They reminded everyone that the noble class stood above nature's chaos, able to tame not just beasts of the field, but spirits of faraway jungles. The monkey's grin and the parrot's call were the exotic laughter of empire, echoing through marble halls. Amid the grandeur of falcons and greyhounds, another creature lived quietly in the shadows of the medieval world: the cat. To the nobility, cats were paradoxes wrapped in fur, adored as protectors, feared as omens, and admired for their mysterious independence. Unlike the loyal dog or the obedient falcon, the cat obeyed no one, which made its affection all the more coveted. In monasteries and noble libraries, cats served a practical purpose. They guarded priceless manuscripts from mice. A cat sitting upon a scribe's table was not a pet, but a silent sentinel, its eyes glowing in the candlelight as it kept vermin from gnawing at sacred pages. Some monasteries even recorded their cats in inventories, describing their colours and temperaments with as much detail as they did their relics. One surviving Irish poem, written by a monk about his cat, Pangur Bán, captures the gentle companionship between scholar and feline, a rare glimpse of warmth in an austere world. In noble households, cats were valued differently. The ladies of the court adored them for their elegance and grace, mirroring their own. Aristocratic cats wore jewelled collars and bells to mark their ownership, lounging on embroidered cushions beside their mistresses. Their sleek, self-contained nature appealed to a class that valued refinement over affection. Yet this sophistication came with a shadow. Medieval superstition linked cats, especially black ones, to witchcraft and the devil. While noble-born cats might be treasured, those owned by the poor were often burned in rituals meant to ward off evil. It was an age where beauty and fear coexisted. Still, many rulers defied the superstition. King Richard II of England was said to have kept a cat constantly at his side, and Cardinal Wolsey's feline companion sat proudly beside him, even during audiences with the king. To those of intellect and power, cats symbolized wisdom, independence, and a calm defiance of human vanity. In art, they crept into the corners of paintings and manuscripts, often unnoticed but always watching. A cat beneath a noblewoman's chair hinted at sensuality and secrecy. Beside a scholar, it represented contemplation. The cat's quiet reign in noble households was subtle yet enduring. Where dogs obeyed and falcons impressed, the cat simply existed, enigmatic, essential, and utterly untamed, ruling the medieval hearth with a silent, unblinking grace. No animal defined the medieval noble quite like the horse. It was more than a means of transport or war. It was a declaration of class, power, and dignity. To be a noble without a horse was unthinkable, almost scandalous. Horses were, in every sense, the living thrones upon which medieval status was mounted. Every rank had its steed. The destrier, massive and muscular, was bred for knights and kings. It bore armour, banners, and the weight of chivalric glory. The courser, swift and agile, carried nobles to hunts and tournaments, while the palfrey, known for its smooth gait, was favoured by ladies for processions and pilgrimages. Each horse had its own stable, its own attendants, and sometimes even its own embroidered blanket displaying the family crest. To the medieval eye, a nobleman's worth could be read in the curve of his horse's neck, the gleam of its coat, and the silver of its bridle. Equestrian culture shaped nearly every aspect of noble life. Tournaments were not just contests. They were stages upon which reputations were forged. When a knight charged into the lists, his horse was as much a performer as he was. Chronicles tell of horses armoured in gilded plates, their manes braided with ribbons, their hooves painted with oil for shine. These were not animals. They were living sculptures, bred from generations of selective care and ceremonial pride. For noblewomen, horses carried a quieter but equally symbolic role. A lady riding a white palfrey through the castle courtyard was a vision of elegance and chastity, an image repeated endlessly in tapestries and poetry. Riding lessons were part of aristocratic education, and a woman's poise in the saddle spoke volumes about her breeding. The bond between noble and horse could border on the spiritual. Knights swore by their steeds, naming them in battle songs as companions rather than beasts. When a beloved horse died, it was sometimes buried with ceremony, its bridle hung in the chapel as a relic of loyalty. To own and master a fine horse was to command both nature and appearance, two forces that defined medieval nobility. The horse was strength disguised as grace, power wrapped in beauty, and for centuries it stood as the most noble of all companions, one that could carry its master's pride to heaven or ruin. While greyhounds and lapdogs symbolized refinement and horses embodied honor, the true measure of medieval grandeur was the ability to possess danger itself. To keep a wild beast, lion, leopard, or bear, was to display dominance over creation. Only the most powerful monarchs dared such extravagance, transforming their castles into living menageries that blurred the line between royal court and primal wilderness. These beasts of prestige were rarely pets in the modern sense. They were living emblems of divine right, creatures so fierce and untamed that only God's chosen could command them. Lions were especially favoured, representing courage, majesty, and the biblical Lion of Judah. England's King Henry I kept a collection of lions and leopards in the Tower of London, while Frederick II of Sicily filled his court with cheetahs and falcons, delighting guests with displays of exotic power. Even smaller kingdoms competed to impress visiting ambassadors with cages of strange animals from distant lands. Bears, though native to Europe, carried their own mystique. In Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, noblemen tamed them for sport, training them to dance or wrestle at feasts. In France and the Holy Roman Empire, A chained bear in the courtyard signified both wealth and audacity, proof that the master of the house feared nothing. Chronicles tell of dukes parading bears through villages on feast days, their collars studded with silver, their keepers struggling to control them as the crowd gasped in awe. Such animals were fed lavishly, meat, honey, and even wine. They required specialized handlers known as keepers of beasts, whose lives were a mixture of prestige and peril. Many of these caretakers came from the ranks of falconers or huntsmen, chosen for their courage and steady hand. One wrong move, however, and a royal symbol of power could become a blood-stained tragedy. To the medieval imagination, taming a predator mirrored the divine order of kingship. Just as God ruled over chaos, so too did the noble rule over nature. Every growl from a chained lion was a reminder to courtiers of their ruler's supremacy. In an age where appearance was everything, nothing spoke louder than a caged roar. These beasts of prestige weren't companions. They were declarations, breathing testaments that the noble's dominion reached even into the heart of the wild. By the end of the Middle Ages, the noble household had become a miniature kingdom of creatures. Each animal, from the smallest lapdog to the fiercest lion, serving a purpose beyond affection. Together, they painted a portrait of a society obsessed with hierarchy, symbolism, and control. The pets of the nobility were not just living decorations. They were reflections of the owners' souls, their ambitions, and their place in the divine order. A noble's relationship with animals revealed his philosophy of power. To command a horse was to demonstrate mastery over movement. To train a falcon was to harness freedom. To tame a lion was to challenge nature itself. Even in moments of tenderness, power lingered beneath the surface. Feeding a cat from one's table, or cradling a lapdog in silk, was as much a performance of mercy as affection. A statement that one could afford gentleness, because one already possessed authority. But these relationships also humanized their masters. The chronicles of kings and queens, filled with wars and betrayals, occasionally pause to note the quiet grief for a lost hound or the fondness for a favored parrot. Such moments remind us that even the most distant monarchs found solace in loyalty untainted by politics. A dog's devotion or a cat's calm presence offered what courtiers could not: unspoken trust. Art preserved this intimacy long after the animals were gone. Paintings, tapestries, and tomb sculptures show noble figures with their pets at their feet, symbols of fidelity, wisdom, or grace. In these images, the animals are not accessories but companions in eternity, bridging the human and the divine. As Europe entered the Renaissance, these traditions evolved. Pets became less about power and more about personality. The noble courts of Florence, Burgundy, and France turned affection into art, commissioning portraits of pampered animals alongside their owners. The medieval notion of dominion softened into something closer to partnership, yet the legacy endured. The jewelled collars, the royal kennels, the hooded falcons, all left their mark on how we understand status and companionship. In the end, the animals of the medieval nobility were more than pets. They were witnesses to a world where love, pride, and power lived side by side, and their silent loyalty outlasted even the empires of their masters. In the cold dawn before battle, the air was thick with smoke and silence. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, sat astride his massive destrier, the beast's black mane rippling like a banner of war. The horse was as much a symbol as a weapon, towering, armoured, and bred for destruction. Together they made a silhouette that stirred both awe and fear, a knight and his living engine of war. To the soldiers who followed him, the Black Prince seemed almost fused with his steed, as if man and animal shared one heartbeat. Chroniclers described the pair as moving with the rhythm of thunder, and when they charged, enemies broke ranks at the sight alone. The destrier wasn't just transport, it was an extension of the prince's will, his fury, and his pride. In the 14th century, the knight's horse was his soul made flesh, carrying his honour into the storm of blades. Edward's destrier would have been a creature of immense power, standing nearly 16 hands high, muscles layered beneath gleaming barding of iron and leather. Its hooves struck like hammers, capable of shattering shields and trampling men into mud. In the chaos of battle, such a horse didn't panic. It charged into fire and screams without hesitation, trained to trust only the hands upon its reins. The bond between knight and steed was forged through years of training, not affection but mutual respect, discipline sealed in blood and sweat. At Crécy and Poitiers, the pair became legend. Witnesses claimed Edward's horse stood firm even when arrows darkened the sky, as if guided by something divine. When the prince dismounted to fight beside his men, the destrier waited motionless, a sentinel amidst the dying. That loyalty became part of his myth, the story of a beast that refused to flee even as men fell around it. For the Black Prince, war was theatre and his horse was the stage. Together, they embodied the ideal of chivalric might, beauty fused with terror. In an age when kings ruled by the sword, Edward ruled by the spectacle of it. His destrier wasn't just a creature of battle, it was the echo of empire itself, breathing, charging, and bleeding beside him beneath the crimson banners of England. Before the Black Prince ever took the field, his war-horse had already lived a lifetime of preparation. A medieval destrier was no ordinary beast. It was the product of bloodlines older than kingdoms, bred with scientific precision in royal and monastic stables. These horses were forged from the best of two worlds, the raw power of northern stock and the fiery spirit of southern breeds. From these unions came a creature that could carry a fully armoured knight into battle without faltering, a four-legged fortress of muscle, discipline, and fury. Training began almost from birth. Foals destined for war were exposed early to noise and motion. Grooms clanged swords near their stalls, beat drums at feeding time, and rode them through smoke to teach fearlessness. They learned to stand calm amid chaos, to obey pressure and tone rather than instinct. A destrier that flinched at the flash of a spear was worthless. One that charged into the storm of battle without hesitation was priceless. By their 4th year, these horses entered formal training under master handlers called destrierers. The work was relentless. Hours of manoeuvring under weight, turns in tight circles, mock charges across uneven ground. They were conditioned to respond to the subtlest touch of the knee or tug of the reins. In the din of combat, where shouting was useless, this communication between rider and steed became their lifeline. Knight and horse moved as one mind in two bodies. The prince's destrier would have undergone this same ritual of refinement, its diet regulated to build stamina, its hooves cared for as though they were weapons. Even its armour was custom forged to protect, but not hinder. A metal chamfron across the face, a criniere over the neck, and plate barding across the flanks. And yet, despite the steel and training, these animals were not machines. Chroniclers wrote that the finest war horses could sense their rider's intent, tensing before the charge, shifting weight before the blow. The Black Prince's destrier was said to obey him without spur or shout, as if their wills were bound. By the time Edward of Woodstock mounted his great horse, the animal was not merely trained, it was transformed. Together they were not knight and steed, but weapon and wielder, crafted by human ambition and centuries of selective mastery. When Edward of Woodstock mounted his destrier, it wasn't simply a rider meeting his horse. It was the fusion of two soldiers who trusted each other with their lives. The bond between knight and steed in the 14th century was sacred, built through routine, repetition, and silent communication. To the Black Prince, his horse was not property, but a brother forged in the same furnace of discipline and danger. Knighthood demanded mastery of both sword and saddle, and that meant knowing one's mount as intimately as one's weapon. The prince's destrier had learned his master's rhythm, when to charge, when to halt, when to shift his weight to strike a balance between power and grace. Horses trained for war could sense their rider's intent long before a command was given. A slight lean of the leg, a tightening of the reins, a shift in breath. These were the signals that guided thousands of pounds of living muscle through the chaos of battle. In the camp, the bond deepened through care. The Black Prince's attendants brushed and fed the horse daily, but it was Edward himself who often rode him in the early morning hours, practicing manoeuvres in silence. Chroniclers noted that he was tender with his steed, as a man with his friend. A rare glimpse of gentleness in a life built on steel and conquest. Before battle, knights were known to whisper prayers into their horses' ears, asking God to keep them both standing. The relationship went beyond sentiment. A knight who did not understand his horse was doomed. A panicked or wounded animal could end a man's life faster than an enemy's sword. Trust was everything. War horses, in turn, learned to follow only one voice, their master's. In the clamour of trumpets and screams, they moved as if guided by instinct alone. Edward's destrier had been his constant companion through campaigns in France and Gascony, enduring long marches, hunger, and the stench of battlefields. Together, they faced the fury of crossbows, the crush of lances, and the mud of history itself. Theirs was not the affection of pet and master, but the loyalty of comrades who had survived death's reach. When the Black Prince rode into war, his destrier didn't follow him. It carried his very legend forward. The year was 1346, and the fields near the French village of Crécy would become soaked with blood and legend. Edward of Woodstock was just 16, but already the embodiment of English chivalry. His black armour gleamed in the dim light, his banner fluttering with the 3 golden lions of England. Beneath him stood his war horse, broad-chested, restless, armoured in iron and leather, its breath steaming like smoke from a forge. The two waited together at the crest of the hill, facing a French army 3 times their size. The Black Prince's destrier was no ordinary beast. It had been trained for this moment, when arrows darkened the sky, when drums and horns shattered silence, when men screamed and died in droves. Where lesser horses might bolt, the destrier stood firm, feeling its rider's calm through the reins. At the prince's signal, it surged forward, its iron-shod hooves tearing through the churned mud. The ground itself seemed to shake. Crécy was chaos, a storm of arrows, lances, and smoke. English longbowmen rained death from the hills, but when the French cavalry charged uphill, the Black Prince met them head-on. His destrier barreled into the enemy line, crashing through armour and flesh alike. The horse's momentum turned the prince's sword into an executioner's blade, cleaving men as easily as grass. The destrier reared, kicked, and trampled, its barding dented, its flanks splattered with blood, yet it never broke stride. Eyewitnesses later wrote that the prince fought most fiercely, and his horse did bear him bravely, though many struck at the beast. Twice the destrier was wounded, and twice it rallied, driven not by fear, but by faith in its rider. When the French knights surrounded them, Edward dismounted to fight on foot, his horse standing above him, snorting and stamping, guarding its master as though it understood the stakes. By nightfall, the battlefield was a graveyard. Thousands of French knights lay dead or dying. The Black Prince and his destrier stood among the survivors, their armour dented, their bodies soaked in mud and blood. It was the horse's endurance as much as Edward's courage that turned Crécy into legend. From that day, man and beast were spoken of together, symbols of English might, bound by iron, honour, and an unbreakable will. 10 years after Crécy, the Black Prince rode again, older, wiser, and even more feared. The year was 1356, and the fields near Poitiers would test not just his tactics, but the endurance of the great destrier that had carried him to glory before. The English army, weary and outnumbered, faced a massive French force led by King John II. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of damp armour. Once again, the prince's black horse pawed at the ground, sensing what was coming. Edward's strategy relied on terrain. He positioned his men behind hedges and vineyards, forcing the French to fight uphill. His destrier stood beside him like a sentinel, armoured with metal plates that glinted through the mist. As trumpets sounded, the prince's calm voice carried through the line, "Steady, wait for them to come to us." Even the horse seemed to obey, breathing slow and deep, its nostrils flaring with anticipation. When the French cavalry advanced, the thunder of hooves echoed across the fields. The prince's destrier responded instantly, charging into motion as if released from a bowstring. The ground shook beneath the weight of armoured beasts colliding. The Black Prince fought from horseback, cutting through chaos with terrifying precision, his sword arcs guided by the destrier's rhythm. Each time the horse reared or pivoted, it opened a path for its rider to strike. The two moved like one body, their balance perfect, even amid screams and flying mud. As the battle wore on, Edward dismounted to rally his archers. His destrier stood firm behind him, waiting, blood streaking its armour, but eyes burning with resolve. When the French king was finally captured, the prince approached on foot, resting a hand on the horse's flank. Chroniclers claimed he whispered a prayer of thanks, not just to God, but to the animal that had carried him through death once again. The victory at Poitiers sealed Edward's legend, but also his bond with his horse. The destrier's endurance and discipline were immortalized in song and chronicle, a symbol of loyalty and strength. In an age of knights and banners, it wasn't the sword or armour that made the Black Prince invincible. It was the living heart that galloped beside him through history. The destrier of the Black Prince was not a creature of the fields. It was a living weapon wrapped in steel. Before each battle, squires and farriers worked like blacksmiths preparing a machine of war. The horse's armour, called barding, was designed to transform flesh into fortress. Plate and chain protected its neck and flanks, while a chamfron, a metal mask shaped to fit its head, guarded its face. Even its chest was covered by a paytroll, engraved with the insignia of the prince's household. Underneath the glittering plates lay layers of quilted padding, cushioning each blow. Every inch of the animal was crafted to endure the shock of combat, yet armour alone could not protect the destrier from the terror of the battlefield. Horses were among the first to meet the enemy's charge, the first to hear the thunder of hooves, to see the flash of spears, to feel the impact of men colliding in chaos. Only through years of conditioning could a destrier hold its ground. Many knights believed these horses possessed a kind of moral courage, a shared will to fight that reflected their masters' hearts. Chroniclers wrote that, "A good horse will stand as his knight stands, and die if his knight falls." The weight they carried was immense. A fully armed knight like Edward of Woodstock might weigh nearly 250 kilograms with armour and weapons. Add to that the destrier's own barding, and the total burden neared 1/2 ton. And yet these animals moved with astonishing grace, able to turn sharply, rear, and even leap when commanded. Their training blurred the line between instinct and command. They fought as much with discipline as with muscle, but war took its toll. Horses were often wounded by arrows or lances, tripping over corpses and armour in the mud. The Black Prince's destrier reportedly survived multiple campaigns, its scars becoming part of his legend. After battle, the animal was tended like a knight, washed, bandaged, fed wine-soaked oats, and allowed to rest on fresh straw while priests gave thanks for both man and beast. In the chronicles of the 14th century, the war horse stood not below the knight, but beside him. It bore his sins, shared his triumphs, and carried his name into eternity. Proof that even in an age of iron, nobility could have 4 legs and a heartbeat. In the 14th century, chivalry was more than a set of ideals. It was a theatre of honour, and the knight's warhorse played a starring role. The bond between Edward of Woodstock and his destrier embodied the very essence of the code: courage, loyalty, and grace under pressure. A knight's conduct was judged not only by his valour in combat, but by how he treated his horse. To abuse or neglect such a creature was to disgrace one's name. To cherish it was to prove oneself worthy of command. The destrier represented everything noble society revered, strength tempered by obedience. When the Black Prince rode through the ranks before battle, his men saw not just a warrior, but an image of perfect mastery. The horse walked proudly, hooves sinking into the earth like the measured beat of a drum, its armour catching the sun. Every motion conveyed discipline. It did not flinch at banners, horns, or the roar of men, because it had been conditioned to mirror its rider's poise. The spectacle inspired confidence. Knights fought harder, knowing their commander and his steed moved as one will. Chroniclers tell that the prince refused to strike his horse in anger, even when it faltered. He believed, as many knights did, that these animals possessed a soul touched by divine purpose. Priests blessed horses before campaigns, sprinkling holy water over their heads. When Adestria fell, squires knelt beside it, whispering prayers for its rest, as though for a fallen brother. The line between human and beast blurred in the shared code of honour and endurance. Horses even featured in the rituals of knighthood. At dubbing ceremonies, a young squire's first mount symbolised his new responsibilities, his rise from servant to protector. The gift of Adestria was more sacred than any sword. It was a reminder that mastery over power required compassion. For Edward of Woodstock, this ideal was lived, not spoken. His Destria's loyalty reflected his own chivalric image, a warrior who led by example rather than fear. Together, they became the living emblem of medieval virtue, man and beast, both armoured, both fearless, bound by trust instead of chains. In their partnership, the knight's code found its truest form, not in words, but in the rhythm of hooves on sacred ground. By the time the Black Prince reached his 30s, the roar of battle had given way to the wheezing breath of illness. Years of warfare, exhaustion, and the slow creep of dysentery left him weakened. But even as his body failed, his warhorse remained his constant companion, a symbol of the vigour that had once defined him. Chroniclers noted that the prince, even when too frail to stand unaided, would still ask to see his Destria brought from the royal stables. The sight of the animal, scarred and aging like its master, stirred in him memories of thunderous charges and banners snapping in the wind. In the twilight of his life, Edward's glory lingered in his legend. Songs across England spoke of the prince who rode in black armour, his horse shining like obsidian beneath the sun. His Destria, too, was immortalised. Though its name is lost to time, it became part of the collective myth, the nameless beast that carried a prince through storms of steel. Together they had written a story that outlived both flesh and bone. When the Black Prince's illness worsened, he withdrew to Canterbury, the heart of England's piety. There, his horse was stabled nearby, tended with care. Some accounts claim he requested that the animal be treated as a brother, not a servant, until its final day. Knights who visited him said he often spoke of his campaigns, but always ended his recollections with mention of the horse that had never faltered beneath him. "A man's honour," he said once, "is the sum of those who bear him faithfully." When Edward of Woodstock died in 1376, at just 45, his Destria reportedly survived him only a short while. It was said to have refused food, standing restlessly for days, as if searching for the sound of its master's voice. Whether fact or legend, the story captured the soul of their bond, the loyalty that transcended language, species, and war. The tomb of the Black Prince in Canterbury Cathedral still bears his armour and effigy, his sword at his side, his spurs beneath his feet. But in the imagination of history, it is incomplete. For somewhere, invisible but eternal, the shadow of his great warhorse still stands beside him, silent, watchful, and ready for one last charge into memory. Long after the Black Prince and his Destria had turned to dust, their legend thundered on through the ages. Chroniclers, poets, and artists transformed them into symbols of everything noble and terrible about medieval war. Together, they embodied the ideal union between human ambition and animal strength, a harmony forged in the chaos of the battlefield and sealed by loyalty. Theirs was not a tale of mere conquest, but of companionship, discipline, and the strange beauty of shared purpose. The Black Prince became the model of knightly virtue for generations to come, but behind his fame stood the silent hero that history seldom names, the warhorse that bore him through Crécy, Poitiers, and every trial in between. Without that living foundation of courage and muscle, the prince's victories would have remained dreams. Chroniclers understood this, often writing of Edward and his horse in a single breath, as if the two were one being, man made will. beast-made motion. War horses across Europe came to be bred and trained in imitation of his destrier. English knights sought mounts of similar size and spirit, creatures capable of both fury and restraint. The great horse became the enduring symbol of knighthood, echoing through tournaments, parades, and royal ceremonies for centuries. Even in the calmer days of the Renaissance, when guns replaced swords, painters still depicted knights on towering destriers. The image of the Black Prince and his steed burned forever into Europe's imagination. Their bond also shaped ideals beyond war. The relationship between rider and horse inspired poets to write of trust without words, loyalty without condition. In that connection, medieval minds saw something divine, proof that order could exist even in the wildest of nature. Kings kept war horses as relics of honour. Monasteries recorded their names in chronicles alongside fallen knights. Today, the Black Prince's armour still glimmers under the vaulted light of Canterbury Cathedral, a relic of iron and faith. Yet no relic remains of the creature that made him legend. The destrier's bones are gone, its name forgotten, but its spirit endures wherever strength and loyalty meet. In every story of man and horse, in every gallop that echoes across time, the shadow of Edward of Woodstock and his mighty steed still rides, unbroken, eternal, and proud.